Welcome to Public Forum, a community outreach program produced by North Idaho College located on Lake Coeur d'Alene. Featuring guests from around the globe addressing a wide variety of subjects, Public Forum serves to educate and enlighten. Please join host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart, in welcoming today's guests.
There continues to be so many discussions, as one would recognize, concerning the horrendous attack upon the United States on September the 11th. This terrible incident has caused all of us to discuss this issue, and on our program today we're going to pursue such questions as: what is terrorism? Who are the terrorists? What options does the United States have in dealing with international terrorism? How can we best secure the safety of the United States and others around the world from these terrorist attacks? We're very, very fortunate to have on our program a true expert on this subject. I welcome to the program Dr. Rand Lewis. He is an expert, as I've said, on international security issues. Presently serves as director of the Martin Institute and the Martin School of International Affairs at the University of Idaho. He holds a PhD in European history, and he retired as a lieutenant colonel from the U.S. Army in 1996. While in the service, he was a foreign area officer and negotiated with over 32 countries, and therefore he's coming to us with years of experience in dealing with the subject. Dr. Lewis, 30 minutes is such a short time, we'll get right to our subject, but again, thank you for taking time to be with us here on the program and also to lecture at North Idaho College.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me.
As always, I'm pleased to have our regular panelist, Janelle Burke, and she will start today's questions with Dr. Lewis.
Thank you.
Dr. Lewis, it's a pleasure to have you here. We're going to talk about a very important subject today, but what is terrorism? What is your definition of terrorism?
Well, it's interesting that you should ask that question, because those of us that are in the business of studying terrorism have found that for every specialist in terrorism, there's a definition of terrorism. Which brings us to a real problem, because when the comment was made, or the statement made by the President, that we were going to have a war on terrorism, no one had really defined the term terrorism. In the last 3 days in the United Nations, that has been one of the key issues, is the countries want to say, okay, we want to participate in putting down international terrorism. However, we need to define what the word terrorism is. Unfortunately, the United States government's definition of terrorism would be something along this line, that it is an attack that is designed to instill fear in a population. Attack, instill fear, population, essentially is a very general statement and makes it very difficult to define exactly what terrorism is. And so as we move into this thing, this war on terrorism, one of the issues we've got to face is, what is the enemy that we're going to be after, and how much of terrorism are we going to deal with?
So now, what is a terrorist? Is it a person who engages in this kind of fear?
Well, absolutely. What you have is you have someone, and it could be anybody, interestingly enough. Terrorists don't necessarily make themselves known very readily. I mean, they don't walk around with a T printed on their forehead or anything like that. It could be anyone who has strong support of a cause, for most part, that would be willing to provide support, resource, or their lives for that cause. They tend to be on the extreme side of something, whether it be Christianity, whether it be Islam, whatever it is, they're extremists.
With that, let's talk about this terrible situation that happened on September 11th, and I want to have you to do what you did in your lecture here today, to give us some history as we take the show in October, and it'll air in November, but on October the 5th, and with Prime Minister Tony Blair's speech yesterday, it's become more and more clear some identification of a organization and a network and its location, as you've said, around the world, but also with the headquarters very likely in Afghanistan. Would you take us through, on some of the shows that we're hearing a lot about some of that too, but you were so clear today on the history of this process, and so would you share that, please?
Sure. I think that it's pretty evident at this point in time that this particular act was perpetrated and probably planned and probably in most cases financed by Al-Qaeda, which is called is essentially the base. And to understand Al-Qaeda, you have to understand that this is a number of different organizations around the world that have common support of a fellow by the name of Osama bin Laden, who is kind of the key player in this particular activity and considered by the United States and now by Blair of England as being one of the principal players in this whole thing. What I'd like to do is first talk a little bit about bin Laden. Bin Laden was Saudi. I said was Saudi. He is from a very wealthy family that provided the support, construction support for the development of Saudi Arabia. Once oil was discovered, the family became very, very wealthy. When his father died, he was left an inheritance of somewhere between $250 and $300 million. He went off to school in Saudi Arabia, and at school he met a cleric that was fairly anti-American, anti-West, primarily because of his interpretation of the effects that the West was having on Islam. And Osama bin Laden picked this up. And in 1979, he then went to Afghanistan in support of the Mujahideen against the Soviets in the war in Afghanistan. Osama bin Laden brought with him, of course, money, and he brought with him the ability to construct, to build things. He worked with the American CIA. He worked with and built an organization called the MAK, which was a training ground for Mujahideen to fight against the Soviets. He did this through the use of his funds, his great deal of money that he had. These particular schools that he developed were on the border of Pakistan and Afghanistan. And the schools then developed not only Mujahideen fighters, freedom fighters, and taught them the principles of fighting against the Soviets, but also taught them a fairly radical and extreme view of Islam. And when the war was over in 1989, Osama bin Laden developed an organization called the Base, or Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda then essentially believes in the same principles as Osama bin Laden does. Now, when does Osama bin Laden become extremely anti-American? It's probably the next best question. Just about the time that we're starting to gear up against Saddam Hussein in Iraq after he had invaded Kuwait. We brought American forces in to Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, of course, is the holy land for Islam. It's where Mecca is located, Medina is located. And in the mind of Osama bin Laden, this was an injection of Western corruption and influence into the Holy Land of all of Islam. And it's the result of that he goes to the royal family and he says, look, we can't have these Americans here. We have to get them out of here because they're corrupting our Islam. The royal family, of course, didn't do that. They maintained support of the U.S. forces during the Persian Gulf War and ultimately provided that support up until today. The result of that was that Osama bin Laden then blamed the royal family as being corrupted themselves by the West. And so he has developed a war, if you will, within his own interests against not only the West and the United States, but also against Saudi Arabia itself, the royal family. He loses his citizenship in 1994. He leaves Saudi Arabia and his family, goes to Sudan. Through United States efforts, he's forced to leave Sudan, and he goes to Afghanistan. And in Afghanistan, he has now developed the distaste of the Americans. He also has all of his money with him because he's been able to develop quite a network. And then with that, we see him beginning the activities through Al-Qaeda against American interests.
Two other quick things. Because of his wealth and his network he has, could one almost say that he's the one that props up the present government in Afghanistan? Without him, I mean, aren't they very dependent upon him? That is
Absolutely.
why they would never give him up to
the Taliban.
be tried for these crimes.
In fact, one of the things I brought up in my lecture earlier today, an intelligence report that I read about 2 days ago, that was an interrogation of one of the bodyguards for Omar, who is the leader of the Taliban. And
in Afghanistan.
In Afghanistan, right. They're, of course, not a government in our minds. Nobody has recognized them except for 3 countries.
And it's down to 1 now, Pakistan.
It's down to 1, Pakistan, and only to keep the opening to the Taliban for potential discussions. But bottom line is that this young man in his interview said, well, the problem is that the Americans are doing this wrong. They say to the Taliban, turn over Osama bin Laden. He says that would never happen. Taliban doesn't have the power to turn Osama bin Laden over, but Osama bin Laden has the power to turn the Taliban over to whomever he pleases. The relationship is extremely close. The Taliban means the students. The students were the ones that were trained under Osama bin Laden's program on the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan in the Mujahideen. And so there's a great deal of loyalty there. Plus, Osama bin Laden provides about $3 million per year to support that government in their efforts against the Northern Alliance. And so the ties are so extensive that the Taliban cannot turn him over, and because they then would be going against, they would be cutting themselves off financially as well as from a number of their supporters.
So you'd have to deal with both if you're going to have any success at all, the Taliban as well as bin Laden too.
Well, my feeling is that Osama bin Laden probably is very key to this, because without him, the Taliban may be in trouble. Now, there are others that could step in and become the leaders of the jihad against the West, but not all of the others have the kind of money and capability and the rapport that Osama bin Laden has with many of the Muslims.
Janelle Burt.
What options do we have then if we're going to go against someone like a bin Laden? What are the options for treating this kind of terrorism?
Well, there are 2 options that we've been looking at in Washington that I've been associated with, and that I'd like to do that through kind of a picture, if I may, kind of a head and a tail approach. The head, of course, is where we would go after the resources that support this al-Qaeda organization, which includes bin Laden and the Taliban. And also we would go with that after that from the standpoint of trying to cut that off with the idea that the tail would shrivel up and die. The other approach is that you go after the tail and you chop the tail off a piece at a time until you get up to the head, and then you eliminate the head. One of them goes fairly quickly in the minds of the Americans simply because we think on a state-to-state basis. All of our activities are we attack another state. We understand that. We understand how to deal on a state-to-state, but we don't know how to deal in this tail approach where you go after a cell or a network one at a time and work back up to the head. The one coming back from the tail up takes a long time. Americans are impatient. That's a difficult one politically to do. If you go after the head, you may get the head, but it may mutate. And so it may not accomplish the task, but you still have the tail, which is still fairly self-sufficient out in the world. And so it's a double-edged sword. What we're seeing now, initially we went after the head, the first week and a half. The government now, the U.S. government now is reevaluating that, and they're starting to look at, okay, maybe we need to go out after part of the head, Osama bin Laden, and oh, by the way, the Taliban might get crushed in this, but we're not going to play the game of fighting the Taliban at this point in time. Go after Osama bin Laden. If we do that and we eliminate him quietly, not overtly but quietly, saving him from being a martyr, then in essence we've eliminated part of the head, but then we go after the organizations that are worldwide one at a time. We've accomplished symbolically striking at international terrorism, and we have satisfied the American public's interest in that. And now we can do the hard work and the plotting work using intelligence and that to break up the al-Qaeda organization worldwide.
It sounds, and again, it's such importance to have you here. You truly are an expert, and there's so many questions to ask. Whichever one does, or the head, or go after the tail, or combination at the same time, there is no way out of this struggle, I hear you saying, without commitment. And the President of the United States, President Bush, has said this also, without a long commitment. It is not going to be like Desert Storm when it lasted a very short period of time.
Absolutely, Tony. And that's what the American people have to realize. And of course, American people just have no patience in most cases. And this is a time, in my opinion, on September 11th, that was a watershed in 2 areas. One, in international terrorism. We'd never seen anything so horrific ever in the history of the world when it comes to a terrorist act. On the other hand, it's a watershed for the Americans because we need to realize that we're part of a global community now, that we cannot sit back and put our head in the sand on the one hand or become complacent, that we have to realize that there are certain requirements for living in that environment, being a power in the world, and understanding that security is important to our own well-being. And so this is going to be difficult because we're talking about civil liberties. We're talking about how we do our business day to day. It's going to change.
Throughout history, there have been changes, and this is you're saying this is certainly, I think, the American people and the world's aware that this is both the Congress and the President have also indicated this is a really new day for us, and it's going to require incredible creative and imaginative policies to deal with it. I want to ask you about some of those. One of them is, how successful can we be working with this new coalition or alliance in tracing the money trail? That is, if they can find the resources of bin Laden and others and freeze those funds around the world, if that can happen, then they wouldn't be able to do the kind of things they're doing without those funds.
Well, I don't know if that's really true, and the reason I think that is just, I think it was this morning or yesterday afternoon I was reading a short article that said that basically this entire operation was done with under $2 million. $2 million is nothing for all practical purposes, and when you take a look at Al-Qaeda, for example, and that's the best, Osama bin Laden himself worth over $300 million, but Al-Qaeda has developed a tremendous resource for monies being provided from other Muslims around the world, from other people around the world, from other governments around the world, as well as investments in banking, investments in construction, and those types of things. So there's a great deal of money going on there. The key to the question, though, is whether we can maintain the collaboration around the world in not only the banking side of it, the financial side of it, but also in the intelligence side of it. Because if we cut off their money, that will help. But ultimately, we still have to have human intelligence. We have to get in there and we have to root these groups out one at a time and bring them to justice. We have to show the world, particularly the other 27 terrorist organizations as identified by the State Department, that you cannot commit the atrocities that were committed, like in New York and Washington, D.C., and get away with it in the international arena. Mm-hmm. And to do that, the Americans also politically have to make a major change in the way we do business. And so the way we deal with foreign policy is going to have to be evaluated, and it'll have to be changed in order for us to retain collaboration with many of these countries worldwide.
One more question before I go back to Janelle on that very subject. Mm-hmm. Are you getting the impression, again, I keep repeating we're doing this on October the 5th, and a month from now when it airs, some of these things may have changed in some ways, but do these various countries, our allies over the years, and even some countries that are joining in that have certainly not been our allies, is there a consensus developing that all these countries are in danger, that these terrorist networks, which are not, in the geopolitics of the past, they're not countries, they're not with boundaries, but they're these international networks of terrorists, that all countries are in danger? Saudi Arabia is an example, their government that bin Laden does not like. Russia has experienced this and others. Does this create an atmosphere in which we might find a kind of cooperation that we've not ever found out in history of combining international cooperation to deal with a new enemy?
Absolutely, and I think this is really a key question, because what we've seen, for instance, in the past 4 or 5 days is particularly from the Russians, and interestingly from India, China, and Pakistan, that they have realized that this could impact them. Take a look at Egypt, for example. They have the Egyptian jihad, or Gamal jihad, that exists in their own country, that has impacted their tourism trade, has attacked all kinds of different elements within the Egyptian community. This is a terrorist organization. It's part of Al-Qaeda also. Same with the Russians. They have had this issue in Chechnya. They have problems in Uzbekistan and other countries that are down in the Muslim regions of the old Soviet Union. And so what we're finding is that here is an enemy that civilized nations worldwide can look at and say, okay, we have a commonality here. This is something that could disrupt any country anywhere in the world, And this is something we can all agree to as being a danger to all of us if we define terrorism appropriately. That's the if.
And I am going to one thing because you brought it up, and I'll go back. The overwhelming majority of the Islamic world, like the Christian world, all opposes this and is not extremist. So without stopping the bin Ladens, does it not endanger the mainstream Islamic world and countries too at the same time?
Well, absolutely, and that's why we're seeing support from both Sunni and Shia countries, Iran, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Oman. We're seeing this type of support because they realize just as well as anybody else that extremism impacts them just as much as it impacts the West. And this is why we have to be very careful in our deliberations and how we approach this issue of a war on terrorism, because we can't alienate these people. They are in the same boat we are. And we all have to paddle together in order to accomplish the long-term goal, and that's get rid of international terrorism at that level. You'll never get rid of terrorism.
Janelle.
I have a two-pronged question. The first part is, how can we secure the U.S.? I'm sure that's on the minds of a lot of people. And the second part of that question has to do with, what are the high-risk targets that might be out there that terrorists might want to use in order to further their cause?
Mm-hmm. What we have to remember is that we can secure ourselves to a point. And really, beyond that, if a terrorist wants to strike, they can always strike. And we'll see that domestically as well as from international terrorism. And so what I would say is that what's happening right now is being wisely done to a point. I worry a little bit about the Ashcroft proposals in that I think that maybe they have pushed the envelope a little bit too far for civil liberties. However, I think that the Congress has been very astute in picking up and looking at this very carefully over the last week, and I think what we're going to end up with is a reasonable package that will preclude a great deal of anticipated effort on the part of terrorists in the United States. We're a free society. As long as we're a free society, we are open for this type of thing. And so I have great faith in Congress. I have great faith in ensuring that those liberties are carefully considered as we develop a security program. Anybody that's gone on an airplane recently can tell you that we have heightened security, or anybody that's been to Blaine, Washington recently can tell you that the mile-long stoppage at the border for them to check everything is in place. I think that another example of it is the temporary use of National Guard at our airports. We're having them brought into the Moscow-Pullman Airport this weekend. They're in SeaTac today. They're going to make a presence, and I think that's important on the short term. Long term, we don't need the military there. What we need to do is the federal government had to make the decision on whether they want to be involved in the security of our airports and our other transportation assets, and I think that's probably a right way of doing business. But we have to be careful to protect the individual rights of the people, but yet protect their lives, and those are the two key issues that the government's facing right now.
And it's a real balancing process.
Oh, yes. Where is the line in the sand? That's the problem. I remember seeing a Gallup poll that said, well, if you had to spend more time and go through security in an airport, would you mind that? And this was only a few days after the incident, and the response was overwhelmingly, we don't mind. This is good. We can do this. We can spend an hour or 2 hours or 3 hours, whatever it takes. The next question is, well, what would you think if you had to have ID cards and you had to check in and you had to do all these other things? And the overwhelming response is, there's no way. So, like you say, there's a line, and what we've got to do is we've got to be careful where we come to get to that line. We've got to listen to the American people to determine where that line is.
What do you think are some of the possible targets?
My personal feeling about it is that I don't foresee another target being hit within the next 6 to 8 months, primarily because it takes a long time to put something like this together. And we have already identified over 38 al-Qaeda organizations or cells in the United States, and they're under observation or in custody at this point in time. So there are probably more we don't know. However, what that does is that really puts them underground for a little while. And terrorists believe in the low risk, high probability of success approach. And so as long as the risk is fairly high and the success may be a little bit lower, they're probably going to wait a little while. And they're going to wait because they know the American people have short attention spans. And if things start settling down and we become vulnerable and we don't pay any attention anymore and we start laying off our security a little bit, then we become vulnerable again. And when we become vulnerable, we're a target. I would say targets would most likely be conventional targeting. What I mean by that is bombs, car bombs, things like that. And I would say that the probable targets will be on the West Coast. And I would think that San Francisco and Los Angeles are probably good possibilities.
With that, because the government has moved in, it's encouraging to hear that a number of people have been arrested and some of these networks have been identified. Also, is it safe to assume that some of them may be trying to get out of the country and that also slows down the whole process? There's somewhat of a disarray in their network as the investigation goes on?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because what I think has happened is that I think that the thought on the part of the group that perpetrated this, and Al-Qaeda is what I would anticipate that is, was that they would force the Americans to respond aggressively, which in fact would play into their hands against Muslims worldwide and then ultimately in the Middle East. And I think that by the administration taking a more measured approach to that and incorporating all of these other players from all over the world in this thing rather than unilateral activity, that it has worked in the reverse of what their anticipated goal was. They accomplished the initial goal, and that is to stop America. They did that. The whole idea of terrorism is to take you out of your comfort zone and put you in a discomfort zone.
We're running out of time, but they didn't anticipate probably this measured response.
No.
And that may also
This
really
will
affect...
slow down. This will slow down. Now what we're going to see is copycat stuff, and Americans need to be aware of that.
Yeah. On that note, we have to bring our program to conclusion. Dr. Rand Lewis, it's been just so informative to have you here. It is always helpful when someone has such expertise, and I know you did that over a long number of years, and thank you for sharing with our audience. We appreciate it so much. On behalf of Janelle Burke and our staff, we thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, as you know, we've been discussing a very, very serious topic today, and I want to remind you again that we take this on October the 5th, and it'll air in November, and there may be some changes from now until then, but certainly you've been able to get some very valuable information from our very great expert, Dr. Rand Lewis. I would like to invite you to be with us again next week at this same time, and we will discuss yet another issue. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
Recorded on the campus of North Idaho College, Public Forum is the longest-running entirely college-produced program on PBS. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us again at this same time next week for another edition of Public Forum on this public television station.